Hi, this is Seth Fleishman with World History by a Jew. Did you like the lecture? Well, guess what? I've got my own YouTube channel, World History by a Jew. You can either search it on YouTube, or if you just go to the address on the screen, that'll take you right to a bunch more of my videos. So if you enjoy what you're watching, you want to see more, you like what you're seeing, then please like the video on YouTube, subscribe to my channel. It's the only compensation I get. If you want to know even more about my projects, then get yourself added to the weekly email. Just send an email over to historybyjew@gmail.com and I'll be happy to add you to the list. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you at a future lecture. I want to tell you the story of Deborah, or Deborah, who is appropriately enough, a Jewish judge, or you could say prophetess, but she comes from the book of Judges. Okay, so let's look at Judges chapters 4 and 5. The people of Israel have lost their way, once again angering Hashem, and they're put under the oppression of the king of Hazor, Yavin, and his general Sisera. All right, so they've been oppressed for 20 years, wondering why God has forsaken them. But now it's time for them to see freedom. So the leader of the Jews in this area was a prophetess / judge by the name of Deborah, and Deborah kind of serves her court sitting underneath a palm tree. So she is commanded by God to summon a Jewish leader by the name of Barak, and they are going to fight back and kick these Hazor Canaanite enemies back away from the Israelites and free the Israelites. So Barak is going to lead an army of 10,000, but he says he will not fight unless Deborah comes with them. So she agrees to. Okay, so the two of them, they face the general Sisera, who leads King Javin's army. And what do you know? The Jews are victorious. But even though the Jews win the battle, Sisera escapes. And he's going to make his way to the tent of a Kenite woman by the name of Yael. She realizes who he is, and she invites him into her tent, serves him some nice warm milk and cookies, and he's exhausted from battle and falls asleep. So then our Yael takes this is hospitality at its finest. She takes a hammer and a tent peg and hammers it through his temple, killing him. Soon after, King Yavin is defeated by the Israelites, and the Israelites will now enjoy 40 years of peace, and we kind of end the story with Deborah leading in a victory song. All right, so now what does this have to do with what we're talking about tonight? So these two sea peoples are next on our list. All right, so we're back to our invasion of the sea peoples. Here's our famous list that the Egyptians gave us, and I want to tackle these two, the Sherden or the Shardana and the Tjeker. All right, so let's talk about these two. Now, how did I come to this? Why are we talking about these two? Well, let's look back on our map. We came to a conclusion at the end of our last lecture, or at least I did, that it doesn't make any sense for the Jews to be fighting up here if their enemy is down here. This tells us there must be people in this area. The question is, does the archaeology indicate that there were people in this area? All right, so that's the trick. That's what we need to look at, is can we identify, are there people here? Are they sea people? Do we know which sea people, and do we know where they're from? Obviously, I wouldn't be doing this lecture if I didn't have the answers to that. So now I'm going to put these two arrows here, and just remember for the rest of this evening, these are our two key places. So we have Dor here, and we have Akko. And we're going to keep coming back to these two. So just make sure you have a general idea. Just think about it this way, without me saying anything else. If the Jews are fighting in this area, it doesn't make a lot more sense that the enemy is located right here. That already tells you something. Okay, so I want to first look at the Tjeker. Now, these guys you can see from two different indications. One is this hat, right? They have a pretty distinctive hat, and the other is this really sharp, pointy beard. So when you look at the reliefs, and there's not a lot where you see these guys, but when you look at the reliefs, this would be the indication that you're looking at the Tjeker. Now, there is a famous story involving them from Egypt. All right, I want to get to that, but what I want you to see is each of these, the people we're talking about, the sea peoples we're talking about, this tells you how many times we see their name. So this should be very interesting to you that the Pelisheth are only listed once, right? As much as we talk about them. They're only listed once in the Egyptian records under Ramses III. Now we're talking to someone that in terms of Egyptian records would be pretty equivalent. Okay, we don't see him in their pictures as much, but basically we only have Ramses III talking about the Tjeker. The nice thing about them is they connect very well with our own Jewish traditions. That's why I want to focus on them for a minute. Now, I'm going to tell you an Egyptian story. Okay, this is the story of Wenaman, and it describes a journey from Egypt to Canaan in the first half of the 11th century BCE. Wenaman, a priest of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, was sent to purchase Lebanese cedar trees for the construction of funeral boats. The story of Wenaman gives us a unique picture of several prosperous towns on the Canaanite and Phoenician coasts. And we learn about some of the sea peoples ruled this coastline. All right. According to Wenaman, the Tjekker were rulers of Dor. So the Tjekker, the people I just showed you, they're rulers of the city Dor, and it's a large port town. Big commercial military fleet was stationed there. Also, what's interesting about the story of Wenaman was that the only ruler name, the only king name given is actually the king from Dor, but they're clearly identified as being of this Tjekker tribe. So thanks to the Egyptians, we have this excellent ancient source telling us exactly who was there. We can identify as the same people that Ramses III was facing. I want to look a little bit beyond the ancient sources, though, and I want to get back to the archaeology. So what I want to do is go back to our pottery. Everyone really liked the pottery last time, so I want to go back to the pottery. This particular slide should look familiar to you from last time. I'm going to take a different angle at it. So what we learned last time was this is Philistine pottery. Notice how multiple colors. It's called bichrome. It's got two colors, and the patterns are more complicated than the others on the screen. The most plain one are the Israelites, right? And then in between we have Canaanite. So if you want to know more about that, see the last lecture, The Real Origin of the Philistines. That's not what I don't want to focus on the old ones today. I want to introduce a new one. So what we noticed at the end of our last lecture is the Philistine pottery looked a lot like the Mycenaean pottery. So again, if you look closely, you'll see these same patterns repeat themselves from one to the next, right? Just stop for a second just so you can see and take a minute to compare, and you'll see over and over, you'll see these patterns repeat. Now I want to introduce a third type, and you can probably guess I'm going to show you what Tjekker's pottery looks like. Okay, so at first glance, it may look like the Philistines, and it's very similar, especially, you're comparing these two. So let me tell you how you can tell it apart, all right? It's monochrome, which means it's one color. So whereas you can see multiple colors in the designs here, we only have one color in the design here, all right? And also with the Mycenaean, you have multiple colors, but we just have the one color and on both examples. So it looks a lot like Philistine, but it only has one color. So that shows us it's influenced by the Philistines, and they have a connection to the Greek world, but it's not as sophisticated as theirs. It's some sort of like compromise type design. So it's great that it has this Greek connection, but yet it's not an exact copy. Why? Because that tells us that it's a different people, that it's probably a different people that would make something like this, even if they clearly had influence from the Greek world. All right. Now, what I want to do is jump to a map. I told you I was going to hit you from all kinds of directions in this lecture. All right. So this map right here shows the 12 tribes of Israel as it was laid out in the book of Joshua. I'm not going to get into the differences with judges and all that tonight. That's a lecture in and of itself. But what I want you to see is that if you look in Judges here, you'll see Dor mentioned. I'm just going to break it down into two different quotes I want you to have for tonight, okay? So in Judges 1:27, we learn that while this is in Manasseh's, right? This is the tribe of Manasseh. This is in Manasseh's territory. Judges 1:27 tells us Manasseh did not dispossess the inhabitants of Dor, right? So in other words, the people of Dor, at this point in Jewish history, the inhabitants were still there. Those people still there were the Tjeker. Now we can see later on in Chronicles. Now Chronicles is just what it sounds like. It's like a King's Chronicle. So it's after there's already a monarchy. We're now going back and looking, and we can see at this point in history, Dor was now part of the Manasseh's territory. So the sons of Joseph is Manasseh. So Dor is now located in Manasseh's tribal lands. So between these two incidences, we know that the Israelites eventually did take it over. All right, now, so let me put this next step here. The next step in our analysis, this two-part issue, and that is, and this is what I didn't want to get into tonight, there are a lot of people that believe the Shekelesh are the same as the Tjeker. Now, the reason I have to at least mention it is, if they are the same people, the Shekelesh have been positively identified as coming from Sicily. If the people who don't think they're the same, that they're two different people, they identify the Tjeker with Tjeker, which is in the northwest Anatolia. Either option gives us the basic idea that this would be in the Aegean world, the Greek world, because at this time, northwest Anatolia was part of the Greek world. We identify it now as part of being modern Turkey, but it was closer to Greece at that point in human history and remained that way for a long time. So we know that they're from the Greek world, regardless of which of these two avenues you take. We have primary sources, the story of Weneman, which I told you. The Almansakan of Amenopi, I'm going to go over a little bit more later, but just know it's another listing of peoples and cities from ancient Egypt. We just went through the Bible, which tells us that at one point the Israelites were not able to conquer it, but later on they were able to conquer it. But what we know from the archaeology, a lot of it really helping with that pottery, because that pottery is very distinctive. We know that it was very short-lived here in Dor. So somewhere they probably settled, the dating is around 1150 BCE. By 1050 BCE, they were out. Why were they out? Well, at that point, it became Israelite territory, which the archaeology shows us that Israelites replaced the people of Dor. And the Bible also tells us that Israelites took over that area, and it became the tribe of Manasseh. Now, I want to show you one other little fun thing I noticed. Someone may take issue with me showing this, but I just thought it was really interesting. So this is that picture that I showed you in the very beginning to identify them in the relief. Notice the hats, right? See the hat and the beard. This has been dated long after. This has been dated, 600 years, 500 years after this story of the Sea People's invasion. But it was found in Dor. And I always have to wonder if possibly the dating was wrong. I mean, it's amazing how much this statue, which is identified as being part of the Persian period, but how much this guy right here looks like the ones in the relief. But maybe it's just my imagination. Still, whether it's true or not, I wanted to show it. So that was kind of fun. All right, so now let's go back and look at I told you our map of the night. So we're going back to our map of the night. We now can locate the Tjeker people, right? So here's Philistia. We now have the Tjeker people. It makes a lot of sense they'd be fighting in this area, right? So that helps us out. But now I want to look at the next people in the neighborhood, and this is, if you look at Akko and Khazor. Now remember, the story that started this lecture was the story of Deborah. And who was Deborah fighting? She was fighting King Jabin, or King Yavin, who was the king of Khazor. Khazor, I should just mention before I go on, is a known, readily accepted center of Canaanite life. It was a very powerful Canaanite city at that point in time. The most famous during this Israelite conquest was always Jericho because of the story of the walls. But Jericho was a minor operator at this point in time. The major player in these Canaanite cities was Khazor. Let's see who was in the area of Akko. And this is going to be the Shardana or the Sherden. You can call them either way, depending on whose language you use. So Shardana or Sherden. So what's interesting about them is look how many X's. They were the only sea peoples listed in all 4 of the Egyptian sources. So that tells you something, okay? Notice the Peliset, the Philistines, 1 source. The Shardana, 4 sources, the only one that had all 4 sources. So we have a surprisingly large amount of information about these people. Now, this slide you saw a couple lectures ago. This was the slide I used to introduce the Shardana. Maybe it's coming back to you now, but I introduced the Shardana to you when you talked about Egypt versus the Sea Peoples. And this is the slide that I showed. So just to refresh your memory, because I know it's been a few weeks since I did that lecture, the Shardana were launching pirate raids on the coast of Egypt. And this is when Ramses the Great Ramses II, Ramses the Great was the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he's not going to put up with this. So he has a plan. He uses his own town as bait, and he waits. His ships and his troops all hidden away in little coves, all hidden away in hills, waiting for these Shardana pirates to attack. And who knows, he waited weeks or months or whatever, but eventually the Shardana reappear, and Egypt springs their trap, and in one large naval action, Ramses the Great's navy defeats this pirate problem for good. Now, the Shardana were captured, but Ramses didn't execute them. Instead, he hired them. And we're going to see for the next couple hundred years, the Shardana actually worked for the pharaohs. They even served in Ramses the Great's personal bodyguard. And also, they just settled in the area around Egypt. It's kind of a happy ending, so to speak, for a bunch of pirates raiding a coast, probably causing terror on the Egyptian people. So we have a nice little happy ending with it. 3 years later, in the Battle of Kadesh, the Shardana would fight with Egypt. They fought on the same side as Ramses the Great. And I talked about the Battle of Kadesh in detail in my Exodus lecture. I don't want to go in too much detail with that, but I just want to say, if you remember that point where Ramses is like all alone, and he just has his personal bodyguard with him, some of those fighting with him at that moment where it looked like he was toast were the Shardana. So they have a special place in Egyptian history, and they are memorialized for their efforts at Karnak. Now, let's look at a few reliefs. I just want to remind you, you've seen these Shardana guys before. Okay, so if you look here, all the guys with the horned helmets are your Shardana, and they could have a little bit of variation to those horns, right? This one is just the horns. This one, you got a little circle on top of it. But just know, if you see these horned helmets, these are the Shardana. In this case, it's interesting because it appears you have Shardana fighting Shardana. And we know when Ramses III fought, there were Shardana on both sides. So it matches the story that, hey, Shardana were fighting Shardana. But in this case, you can see the Shardana are fighting the Philistines. See, here's our Philistine feathered hair dress. And in this case, we see the Shardana on the Egyptian ship. But if you look very closely, they're handcuffed. All right, so these are Shardana prisoners. So these guys are kind of like all over the place, to put it simply. All right, now let's go back and take a look at another map. This map is giving you a view of really kind of, it's like a cross-section of the archaeology mixed with the ancient cities. And where I got this from was a map 25 years ago, the active digs in Israel. I think it was 1995, but whether it was 96 or 94, somewhere around there. And I thought it was great that at this one point in archaeological project history, they're working on all these sites we're talking about tonight. So I just wanted to show you this map because this is really what we want to talk about. The only one that's missing was Akko, so I put Akko in here. Never want to forget Akko. The Shardana had a good 250 years of history in Egyptian records. Now, and I want to compare that to the Peliset. The Peliset occurred in Egyptian records for only about 80 years. So you're talking about a people that were around over 3 times longer in Egyptian records. The Shardana are much, much more significant than the Philistines are in Egyptian records. As I noted in the previous slide, they served Ramses II, but also Merneptah, and they would continue serving pharaohs all the way up to Ramses V. So that's in the 1140s BCE. As I said, they fought for and against sea peoples. They fought for and against Egypt. I was thinking about showing you this list. It's like this long of all the ancient sources that mention the Shardana. But I just thought there'd be no point other than me I just wanted to tell you that there's a very long list from a number of different people talking about it. But they appear in Canaanite sources. They're mentioned on the El Armana tablets. And they also, if my favorite city-state, Ugarit also talks about them. It talks about them being mercenaries who settled down and married local women. By the way, that would put them in this neighborhood. Ugarit would be about, I know I'm off the map here, but Ugarit would be about right up here. So to have them living in this area when Ugarit's talking about them would not be a big surprise. Okay, now I want to show you what happened, what we can identify that happened to them after the Bronze Age collapse. And this is that Onomasticon of Menope, which it's actually going to come back again, not tonight, but it's going to come back in a later lecture. This is very important for identifying what cities and what people are in each location along the coast. And Egypt is clearly telling us in this document that the the Shardana people settled in the area of Akko. Okay, so what I just want you to see that, okay, here it is from the British Museum. There's more than one copy, but this is the copy in the British Museum. And I just want to make the point that it's verifying Shardana people settled in Akko. Let's go look at some artifacts, all right? It's a lot of documents I'm showing, it's a lot of maps I'm showing you. I want to look at some more artifacts. These are interesting guys, right? I just want you to look, if you see these warriors, here's the Shardana from Egypt on the left, and now I want you to look at each of these warriors. See, they all have these rounded shields. I've told you in previous lectures that you can identify the sea peoples with the rounded shields. They have this kind of this fat sword. You see the fat sword? See, interesting. And of course, what most everyone's going to notice, me too, the first thing I looked at was it has these guys have the horned helmets, right? Very distinctive. This is the only people that we see with the horned helmets in the Egyptian reliefs. Here's the guys with the horned helmets. So where were these discovered? Are you betting Egypt? Are you betting Israel? Maybe Lebanon or Syria? Actually, you would be very far off. These guys were actually discovered in Sardinia, and they've been dated to about 800 BCE. There's been tons of these characters discovered, and 800 BC is kind of like an average. It's not they're not all around the same, but it's interesting that you would have they really look exactly like what we picture from the reliefs, but they're in Sardinia. Just to remind you how far away that is, I want to pull out this map real fast. So we are talking about Israel way over here, and Egypt right here. And you have to go all the way from Crete to Greece to Italy to Sicily and bounce all the way over here to go to Sardinia. That's a long ways away to see the same characters we have in Egypt. So does that make sense? So what I'd like to do is look at a couple other artifacts. This structure on the top left is called a nuragi. All right, you see this domed look? You have this keystone and then this dome built around it. And then here's another similar idea here on this one, but of course the dome doesn't look so good anymore. Hey, the building's old, give them a break, it lasts a long time. And then finally we have this structure right here. It has that keystone. It kind of looks like that same type build, but it's fallen. All right, so where do we think these are from? Y'all are probably already guessing what I'm going to say. This is from Sardinia. This one's also from Sardinia. This one is from Israel. Okay, so Elawat in Israel. It's very close to Megiddo. And this would actually be in the same neighborhood of Dor. So it's kind of, and I'll show you again on the map next time we get there. But just know that this is found in Israel. It looks to be the same structure. Now I want to look at these ceramics. Okay. I want you to pay special attention to these little lines here that shaped like a triangle, and then these little dots. You see these little lines, then these little dots? Well, the top one was found in Sardinia. Guess you're going to know what I'm going to say here. The bottom was found in Israel, the same place as the nuragi structure was. And then finally you have this chariot linchpin. Now, I'm not going to show you what it looks like in Sardinia versus Israel. I will tell you this one was found in Israel, and it was also found in Elawat. Now, I want to look at a biblical quote with you. Now, we're going to go back to our story of Deborah that started tonight. And the Lord surrendered them to King Yabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. His army commander was Sisera. All right. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, for Sisera had 900 iron chariots. Okay, what is a chariot linchpin? This is what a chariot driver would refer to as a hubcab. That's right. So just like in a car, we have the nice little decorative hubcaps. Well, in a chariot, which were pretty expensive pieces of equipment back then, they also had a little decorative hubcap. So this is actually a chariot hubcap, and it was found in the palace of a royal governor in Elawat in Israel. More on that in a minute. Now, so just want you to see the story again. I'm not going to torture you with going through the story again, but we're going to be talking about Sisera. This right here, the guy who was killed when Yael drove a tent peg through his temple, which is a pretty memorable way to die. All right, now remember our chariot linchpin when we move on to the next slide. All right. What do we know about the Chardonna? First of all, we know that they were in the area of Akko, thanks to the Egyptians. We have clear evidence of them in Elawat. So let's look. Here's Elawat. Okay, if you Akko would be about right. I'm sorry, it's not on this map. This map's really good. I'm going to show you why in a minute. But Akko would be about right up here, and Dor would be about down here. So this is our area that we've been talking about. There's Megiddo. Now, Megiddo had a very famous battle from our Thutmose III lecture. So Thutmose III fought there in 1457 BCE. If you want to see that lecture, it's on my YouTube channel. It's called the Joseph Lecture, and I'll talk about this. But in that lecture, Thutmose III in 1457 BCE is attacking Megiddo, and his commanders tell him to either head north in a big opening through the mountains or head south in another big opening through the mountains. And he goes, no, I'm going straight through the center and the Aruna Pass, because no one would think I'd be crazy enough to lead my army through that narrow pass. And so that's what Thutmose does, and he surprises his enemies, and he wins a great victory. All right, so that's the Battle of Megiddo. Now I want to get back to our battle here when Barak leads the Israelite army against Sisera. It seems Sisera was overly confident, and he headed up from Elawat through the Aruna Pass, thinking there was no way this ragtag Israel army was going to defeat his chariots. But what do you know? He's in this tight pass in the mountains. He can't use the chariot force to his greatest effectiveness, and the Israelites trap him in this pass. The exact same scenario Thutmose III's generals were worried about. Didn't happen to Thutmose III, but here it is, 300 years or so later, it's going to happen to Canaanites against the Israelites. Nice story, right? By the way, that's speculative. There could be people that would disagree with that, but we get from the, you can see from here what we get from the Tanakh is God helped them out and the Israelites defeated them and blah, blah, blah. So this is kind of considered the more, how would you actually put that down into a logical battle plan? All right, so Elawat's very interesting because it was short-lived. It seemed it was only around 50 years here, and by the mid-1100s, Elawat was no longer a base of operations for the enemies of the Israelites. But what we're trying to work here is our origin of Sardinia. All right, so let me look at the book of Judges again. What do we know? Akko was not under Ashur's control at this point in time. How do we know that? Well, look, neither did Ashur drive out the inhabitants of Akko. So just like we learned that Manasseh didn't drive out the residents of Dor, at this same point, it's the line, the couple sentences, they're only like 3 sentences apart. At this same point, the tribe of Ashur had not driven out the people of Akko, okay? Sisera, we know, commanded the army from Khazor for King Jabin. He was battling Israelites led by the Judge Deborah, or we'll call her the notorious Deborah, and General Barak. And the Israelite army then defeats King Jabin and General Sisera. Sisera then flees the battlefield and he's killed by Yael. Okay, we've gone over that enough tonight. All right, why am I coming back to this? Well, first of all, I just want to point out that after this battle, we're done with Khazor in the Tanakh. There's no more story of the Khazor stopping the Israelites from anything. They're finished. We also can see from the archaeology that around this, the 1000s or so, around 1100, people disappear, and the people that did live in Akko are no longer there. They're replaced by Israelite culture. We can see that in the archaeology. So now, here we go again. Let's go back to our chariot linchpin and see what we can learn. So this chariot linchpin was found again in a royal governor's house in Elawat. All right, now we're going to jump to etymology. All right, it's time for a little bit of etymology. I want to look at Sisera's name. He's the only individual with that name in the Bible. There's no instance of this name in Hebrew, in Egypt, or amongst the Hittites. However, we have seen this name in other places in archaeology. In Ugarit, my favorite city-state, we have this archive, and the archive reports on the Shardana colony. Remember I said that Shardana mercenaries settled near Ugarit, and one of their leaders was a prince named Sisera, and that when I said, let me say it slower, Cisaru. Now, if you look at the connection between the two phonetically, this is the same as the name Sisera. I'm not done. If you go to Crete, so the island of Crete, so we're not going all the way to Sardinia, just to Crete, about halfway or thereabouts. There is a Nugaric settlement. So Nugaric, those are the ones that build the Nugari, the houses, that domed house. Their culture is called the Nugaric people. There was a settlement of those people, and one of the leaders there was a tablet with the name of Sisera. What do you know? Sounds kind of familiar, but I'm not done yet. I wanted to point out, it would really help if there was a place called Sisera. That would really make a connection. And what do you know? There is a place called Sisera. It's the second largest city in Sardinia. So if you look at Sassari, that is phonetically the same name. I hope you like my little postcard from Sardinia. I've never been there, but I thought I'd at least show a postcard from it as though I had. And you have an actual place name using the same name as this general. And where is that place name? There's only one of these cities in the Mediterranean, and that's in Sardinia. Okay, so if the Chardonna are from Sardinia and Sisera is a Sardinian name, the Israelites faced a Canaanite army with Shardana leadership. You see how it's all coming together? So the Shardana, who are these experienced warriors, were the ones leading the Canaanites against this Israelite conquest. They were trying to stop them. So now it's all kind of coming back together. So we're going to bring back our map for the night, since it's all coming back together. And I want you to look. So we've now identified, so here's our Philistia. Here's Dor, where the Tjeker were. Up here in this purple is where the Shardana were, and I just left Hazor so you'd see it. Here's where our northern battles were with the Israelite conquest. But there's two big pieces of the puzzle missing, right? We're looking at Israel. Right here, we're already in Lebanon. I'm focused on Israel. There's two big chunks of Israel that we still don't recognize as to what they are. And I'm going to use my two arrows. These two arrows are going to lead us to our next lecture and our last lecture on the Bronze Age collapse, when we talk about the Amalek's Philistines and the Jewish Philistines. So you have to come back next time to learn more about that. So I'm going to summarize. I'm going to finish up here and summarize for you what we learned tonight. The Philistines in the Bible include all sea peoples, even those outside Philistia. So a bunch of sea people settled in Israel. We have been able to name a good bit of them at this point, and it doesn't matter whether they settled in Philistia or not, they're all called Philistines, even though there's in general other sea people tribes. So what I want to point out is we're actually going to identify that this entire coast has sea peoples involved here. And we're going to go up the entire coast of Canaan until we have it covered. The Tjeker settled in Dor. So here's Dor again. Once again, they left Akko out of. Once again, they left Akko out of the map. So I put Akko in here. The Shardana settled here and around Akko, but they moved down here. So it was more like, maybe I should have had a circle, but it's more like this. Okay, the Shardana were actually the most recorded sea people. They easily beat the Philistines. By far, the Shardana are the most recorded sea peoples. They were originally from Sardinia, and then they settled in the area that would become the tribe of Asher. All right. There is a distinct possibility that when Deborah was fighting the Canaanites, they were actually fighting a combined force of Canaanites and the Shardana people, thereby making Sisera a Sardinian or Shardanan general. All Tjeker and Shardana lands would come under Israelite control by about 1050 BCE. This matches what we are told in the Bible, but it also shows in the archaeology that clearly the Israelite culture came in and replaced this sea people or Philistine culture. That does it for tonight. So I appreciate those of you being on. And at this point, I will open the floor up for questions.